Okay, so this lecture is going to continue our talk on Chapter 10 on personality. It's going to be a bit shorter. Personality theory was a lot to get through, so this one shouldn't be as bad. So let's talk about personality traits. These consist of habitual personality characteristics and behaviors that are displayed by individuals across different situations. Okay, so they're the traits that you engage in no matter the situation that you're in. And the traits that people engage in are what constitute someone labeling you as like shy or friendly, relaxed, or outgoing. It's because you portray or engage in certain behaviors that are these traits of personality. So, trait theory seeks to identify those basic traits that are needed to describe any given personality. So, for someone with a quote unquote shy personality, which basic traits are present? Theories on personality traits aim to identify how many traits are necessary to result in someone being one personality over another, and also deciding which traits are most important to any given personality. So, if the theory is too specific, it will end up with traits that can only be observed in very specific situations. We wouldn't have a broad, generalizable set of traits, right? It'd be too specific. But if the theory is too broad, it could lose the ability to predict specific behaviors altogether. So there's a fine nuance in terms of establishing which traits are necessary in a theory. So let's look at some of the trait theories that have been presented in the study of personality. So Gordon Allport was a psychologist in the 30s, and he was one of the first psychologists to really focus on studying personality in and of itself. So he's sort of known as one of, if not the founding figure of personality psychology. And he started research on personality and found that there were over 18,000 terms in the dictionary that were used to describe personality. So that's a lot, right? So he sort of did his own little research, and that's what he found. So what he did was he narrowed this down to 171 traits that he identified. Okay. And he divided these traits, these 171 traits, into three fundamental categories. We're going to have cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. So, cardinal traits consist of a single overriding characteristic that directs most aspects of your behavior. So, for example, a selfless person directs all of their efforts and behavior to helping others. Essentially, it's the main characteristic of your personality. And these cardinal traits, though, the idea that a person has one overriding characteristics are thought to be rare. Okay, so it's not that everyone has these cardinal traits, and in fact, it's rare that anyone does only have one, but rather that there are these central traits that since very few people have this sort of one dominant trait or the cardinal trait, really what we see is that most people have a collection of 5 to 10 central traits so that make up their core personality. So for example, if you have a central trait of warmth, then you're more likely to be sociable, friendly, caring, and all of those things as well. Okay. Finally, the third category is secondary traits. So these are characteristics that affect behavior in fewer situations. They're less influential than the cardinal or central traits. Okay, so think of these as very specific traits to the individual, such as things like not eating meat, or loving fine art, or getting nervous before a speech. Another personality trait theorist is Hans Eysenck, and he proposed the three dimensions of personality theory. So, this theory uses factor analysis. So, this is a statistical method to identify patterns between large number of variables and combining them into groupings. So, therefore, associating certain traits with others to identify patterns of personality. The first dimension in Eysenck's theory is extroversion. So this describes the level of one's sociability. So someone who rates high on this variable would be considered sociable, assertive, active, and lively. In other words, extroverted, right? Versus someone who rates low on this variable would be considered inhibited, serious, or cautious, or introverted, right? The second dimension is neuroticism, or one's emotional stability. So those that score high in neuroticism are considered to be anxious, tense, and moody, whereas someone with a low score of neuroticism would be considered to be calm, relaxed, or stable. Okay, more emotionally stable than someone who is scoring higher on the neuroticism scale. And the third dimension is psychoticism, or the degree to which one's reality is distorted. So someone who scores high on this variable would be considered egocentric, impulsive, cold, or maybe antisocial. Whereas someone who scores low on this variable would be considered empathetic, warm, and able to control their impulses. That's Eysenk's three-dimensional trait theory. Here we have another theorist, Raymond Cattell, who also used factor analysis, much like Eysenck, and Cattell identified 16 main personality traits or factors that are common to everyone. Okay, so you see these sort of 16 traits listed, and you have on one end sort of low scores, which would be indicative of what you see on the left. And then high scores would be more indicative of what you see on the right for each of the 16 factors. So everyone has some level of each of these traits, but some more than others. And what you're seeing on the graph there, so like an airline pilot versus a creative artist versus a writer, and you're looking at the different personality traits and how they measure on Cattell's scale. And this brings us to the most influential and currently used trait theory called the Big Five personality traits. These are also identified through the use of factor analytic statistical methods, so much like Cattell and Eysenck. So these are all using mathematical equations to sort of produce these personality traits. So the 5 factors are identified that underline all personalities. So essentially what they're saying is all personalities are made up of these 5 essential traits, just at different levels, right? Depending on the personality you are, it's going to have more or less of each of these 5 main traits. And these seem to be fairly consistent across different cultures as well. The specific 5 factors create the acronym OCEAN, so that makes it a little easier to remember. So O is openness to experience, C is conscientiousness, E is extroversion, A is agreeableness, and N is neuroticism. Okay, so first is openness to experience. And this trait describes the level to which people are open to trying new things, so new experiences, meeting new people, appreciating new ideas different from your own. So people high in openness prefer variety and have a broad range of interests. They're often considered to be creative individuals and are open to new things. Versus those who are low in openness prefer routine, so similar experiences, the same people. They're often considered more conventional or practical. Then we have conscientiousness. So this is the tendency to show good impulse control and act dutifully or disciplined. Okay, so highly conscientious people are achievement oriented, they're well organized, and they tend to be mindful of details. Versus those who score low in conscientiousness, they tend to be more careless, impulsive, and disorganized. Next, we have extroversion. So this is characterized by one's level of assertiveness, sociability, and excitability. So people who score high in extroversion are described as outgoing. They often gain energy in the company of others. Whereas people scoring low in extroversion are described as tentative, quiet, and unsocial. Now, keep in mind, we tend to look at these as good or bad, and this can be applied to most of the personality traits, but certainly with extroversion and introversion, I think there's a bias to these, especially with extroversion. Introverts are often thought of as unsocial or unfriendly or cold, right? Not warm, which really isn't true. And I posted a TED Talk video sort of discussing this issue a little bit. It's a really interesting video. You don't have to watch it, you're not going to be tested on it. But I came across it and I just thought it was really interesting to listen to her talk about these preconceived notions we have about people who are, quote unquote, more introverted than those who are extroverts. And she really talks about or discusses the issue of confronting our preconceived notions on whether extroversion is really better than introversion, or if maybe they're just different, right? And that one is not better than the other. So check out that TED Talk video if you're interested in that. The fourth trait is agreeableness. So this trait is characterized by one's tendency to be kind, affectionate, cooperative, and altruistic. So people who score high in this personality trait tend to be more compassionate, whereas people lower in this trait tend to be cold or unfriendly. And finally, the fifth personality trait is neuroticism, or one's emotional stability. So this trait characterizes the level to which one experiences negative emotions. So things like anger, anxiety, depression. Okay. So low levels of neuroticism, they indicate higher emotional stability, right? Whereas high levels of neuroticism increase the likelihood of experiencing these negative emotions. They're prone to mood swings. They experience high levels of stress. So this trait really contrasts emotional stability and even temperedness with negative emotionality, such as feelings of anxious, nervous, sad, intense, and so on. So personality trait approaches overall do lend themselves to some sort of measurement, which is great, different from some of the psychodynamic theories of personality we discussed previously. So by using statistical analyses, they're able to link certain traits with others, and then you can test hypotheses or predictions of an individual's personality traits. Overall, the big five appears to be the most consistent across cultures, and thus you're able to measure and compare the same things. And that concludes our talk on trait theories.